Thank you, Eliza. Today I will be speaking about contested memory, Ukraine and Russia. I think that today we hear a lot about how the war started, how the war happened. And the question that I'm asked very often, why did it start so all of a sudden? So one of the goals of my talk today is to show that the war that escalated just a week ago didn't start all of a sudden. And of course, we can have some chronological sequence. We can talk about how the war was developing in terms of chronology, but I would like to focus on larger, broader ideological landscape and scope, and those memory frameworks that contributed to the growing tension between Ukraine and Russia, which eventually led to this absolutely brutal and barbaric Russia's attack on Ukraine that happened a week ago. I will be talking about contested memory, and as you can imagine, there are a lot of manifestations contemporary of contested memory that we can talk about, but I will focus on the essential one, on the fundamental one, which is the contestation which is fundamental in my opinion. And this contestation focuses on Russia's failure to see Ukrainians as a distinct nation that has its right to define its own development. This denial again, didn't happen all of a sudden, and it will take us back to the 19th century. So that's the goal of my presentation today, and that's essentially what I would like to focus today. So I won't go into details about what contestation is in terms of theory. It's a different conversation, but I would like just to specify those three elements that we can keep in mind while talking about contested memory in Russian-Ukrainian context. So the first one, it will be subtlety, the second one, difference, and the third one, distinctiveness. And as we talk about contested memory, we also talk about lack of openness to recognize difference and distinctiveness. As I mentioned, I won't explain how I came up with this distinction of contestation and what's the theoretical background here, because it's a different conversation. But I would like to proceed to a more empirical part of this talk. So in terms of Russo-Ukrainian relations, we specify this Russia's rejection of Ukrainians' distinctiveness as a nation, which is aggressively integrated in today's Kremlin rhetoric. And I will talk about Putin's article today that was published in July of 2021, where he mentioned that Ukraine is just part of the Russian history and Russian culture and so on and so forth. And if you were following his speeches right before the invasion took place, he also mentioned that Ukraine is some sort of an artificial state that was created during the Soviet Union, and Ukrainians have to be thankful to Vladimir Lenin for this creation. So what are the manifestations of this rejection, Russia's rejection of Ukrainians' distinctiveness as a nation? Here, I'll specify at least three of them. The first one, Russians and Ukrainians are quote unquote the same people. And this is the idea that Putin repeats all the time. This statement blurs the boundaries between the two distinct peoples and shifts the emphasis to the Russians as a dominant group in Ukraine, because when Putin says that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, he means that Ukrainians are practically Russians. The second item that contributes to the contested memory is the idea of eternally Russian lands. And this myth was instrumentalized during Russia's annexation and occupation, I would rather say, Russia's occupation of Crimea and Donbass. And the last one is the language issue. This is a big issue, which again is instrumentalized by the Kremlin propaganda. And the problem here is that there are a lot of Ukrainians who speak Russian, but they are not Russians. But that's not what Mr. Putin, for example, is propagating and is including into his rhetoric all the time. According to his words, those Ukrainians who speak Russian are Russians. There are a lot of instances that we can analyze to somehow trace this, these manifestations of contested memory, but today I would like to focus on 3 of them. On Putin's article, as I already mentioned, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and on 2 documents that take us back to the 19th century. Valuev Circular, 1863, Ukrainian, the circular that banned Ukrainian language, and Ems Ukaz of 1876, another language ban, which was introduced by the Russian Empire. The idea is to show the continuity of this rejection of this denial of the right for the Ukrainians to determine their own nation and to determine their own development, again, as a nation and as a state. Valuev Circular and Ems Ukaz, I will start with these 2 documents, and they are known in the Western environment for Ukrainian studies. But I wish we would be engaging with these 2 documents more carefully, because they can really help us understand how this idea of Ukrainians as a non-existent group was developing and was being transmitted from generation to generation, from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union, and then later to the Russian Federation. So I will start with the Valuev Circular, and again, I will not be including some background information, why it was introduced or where it was introduced, because all this information can be easily found in available sources. I will concentrate on how we read these documents. So Valuev Circular was implemented in 1863, and it was a secret document. Here I have one fragment in Russian, if you read Russian, so you can read this statement. But I will read the English translation. So what was the purpose of this document? So this document says, the Minister of the Interior has deemed it necessary to issue on an order on censorships concerning the publication of books in the Malorosian language. Only those works which are in the category of bell letters are permitted. The approval of books in the Malorosian language that have religious content, as well as those of a pedagogical nature, or that are intended for mass consumption, is to cease. So anything that is written in Ukrainian was banned from the public space, except for this category which was defined as bell letters section. So what does this document do? On the one hand, it explains what is to be banned, but on the other hand, it also creates some certain perception of the Ukrainian language. And this document is, first of all, known for this very infamous statement: the Malorosian language didn't exist, doesn't exist, and cannot exist. And this is the rhetoric which to some extent is repeated today by Putin when he talks about Ukraine. In other words, this document prescribes that the Ukrainian language doesn't exist. But my question here is, if we ban something that doesn't exist. So how can it exist then? So what are we banning? We cannot ban a non-existent entity. So there is some inconsistency in this formulation. However, this inconsistency was dismissed and it wasn't paid attention to. And this kind of understanding of the Ukrainian language was widely spread. In addition to this, the Ukrainian language was highly politicized by Imperial Russia. So the document also said, something to the effect, speaking Ukrainians, to speak Ukrainian means that they are pursuing some political plans, and those political plans were defined as separatist plans. Again, this is a language from the document. So in other words, those who speak Ukrainian are alien and foreign to both Ukrainians and Russians. Furthermore, the document categorizes those who speak Ukrainians almost not only as separatists, but also as criminals. So this document creates this perception of Ukrainian speakers as someone who are illegal. They should be persecuted because they go against the Russian Empire. And the last point that this document somehow emphasizes is the, so to speak, cultural perception of the Ukrainian language. The document says independent Malorosian literature, and those who write in Ukrainian, they have more or less beautiful talent. So this statement underlines some backwardness of the Ukrainian language and those who choose to speak Ukrainian language. So that's what the document does. It's not just describes what is to be banned, but it also creates some perception in terms of political characteristics, in terms of culture, in terms of history of the Ukrainian language in general. So then the document also explains that the Ukrainian speakers do not need the Ukrainian language because they understand the Russian language, and probably they understand the Russian language better than they understand the Ukrainian language. So again, it sets up some rules, what language to speak and what language not to speak, and it completely annihilates the necessity to speak Ukrainian. I connect to this attitude towards the language to the memory scope. And when the language is prohibited and when nothing in this language can be edited, it somehow shapes the way we remember ourselves as part of some ethnic or national group. In other words, the document annihilates the memory, the independent memory of Ukrainians as a separate group, separate and distinct from the Russians. So then the next document that followed 13 years later was EMS Ukaz. And the EMS Ukaz practically repeated the same rhetoric as was used for the Valuev circular, but the prohibition was even more severe. In addition to publications, all public speeches were prohibited. All public speeches in Ukrainian were prohibited. Then it put a ban also on the publication of Ukrainian folklore, unless it appeared in the common Russian orthography. All stage performances, lyrics and musical scores and public readings and lectures in Ukrainian were banned as well. So this document enlarged the scope of those engagements that could be possible in Ukrainian. So there are a few things in this document that I would like to specify to, again, demonstrate how this language of rejection of Ukrainians' right to not only develop the language, but just to use this language developed. So the UKAS legitimized the surveillance over the educational institutions, and that's what the following statement says: strengthen supervision by the local educational authorities in order to prevent the teaching of any subjects in the Little Russian dialect in the primary schools. Then Note 2 said it would be considered useful to take it as a general rule to appoint teachers who are Great Russians to educational institutions of the districts of Kharkov, Kyiv, and Odessa, and to send the Little Russians to the educational institutions of St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Orenburg districts. So in other words, the Russification was total at this point, and not only the imposition of the language, but the imposition of some certain memory was underway with these restrictions. So another point that was added in this document focused on publications. The Russian Empire wanted to support financially those publications which would be in support of the Russian language outside the Russian Empire. And the final point of the UKAS ordered to exile from Ukraine Mikhail Dragomanov, a Ukrainian scholar and an activist of the national movement, and Pavlo Chubrinsky, a poet and ethnographer who was author of the poem which became the Ukrainian anthem. So in a nutshell, what was accomplished by these two documents? Of course, a tremendous damage was done to the development of Ukrainian language, and as a result to the formation and realization of national aspirations in Ukraine. But on the other hand, the Ukrainian language, these documents, in fact, recognize the existence of the Ukrainian language, and the Ukrainian language continued to exist in spite of these imperial restrictions. However, these points which were outlined in these two documents traveled to the Soviet Union, and they traveled to the 21st century, and they are manifested in Putin's rhetoric today. So now I'll proceed to this article, which was published by Putin in July 2021, in which he also mentions Valuyev and M's UKAS, but very briefly. He does that very briefly, the tone of this article somehow resonates with the tone of these two documents. Putin's article is just as prescriptive as the two documents of the 19th century, and it also focuses on Russo-centric version of Russian history, and anything that deviates from this Russo-centric version a priori is false and divisive. And again, the ultimate message of Putin's article was that Ukrainians and Russians are, quote unquote, one people. So let's look at some specific fragments from this article. So in which the documents from the 19th century are mentioned. I'm not going to idealize anything. Both the Valuyev Circular of 1863 and the Ems Ukaz of 1876 are known, which restricted the publication and import from abroad of religious and socio-political literature in the Ukrainian language. And then there is this treacherous but. But the historical context is important here. These decisions were made against the backdrop of dramatic events in Poland, the desire of the leaders of the Polish national movement to use the Ukrainian issue in their own interests. So again, the agency of Ukrainians is undermined. In other words, they were doing what was good for the Poles. So they were not making their own choice in terms of developing their language, but they were following the sentiments which would be beneficial for the Poles' national aspirations as well. So, in other words, Putin underlines that that wasn't Ukrainians' choice to develop their nation and to develop their language. Then Putin proceeds by accumulating inaccurate facts about those disastrous effects that the two documents brought. I will add that works of art, collections of Ukrainian poems, folk songs continue to be published. Objective facts indicate that in the Russian Empire there was an active process of development of the Malorossian cultural identity within the framework of the large Russian nation, uniting Velikoruсы, Malorossi, and Belarusians. So this is, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, my talk is not supposed to be some fact check, because all these facts that Putin somehow manipulates and falsifies can be checked easily. The only thing that I would like to say here is that there is a study of the two documents by Arthur Miller, where he mentions that during 1863, 1866, not one single Ukrainian book was published. Or if there are some other data that say that maybe one or two books were published. So what Putin says is not true at all. And again, he combines those facts which work for his rhetoric. Then Putin goes on and comments on how the Poles and the Ukrainians started entertaining the idea about national autonomy separate from Russian nationality. At the same time, among the Polish elite and some part of the Little Russian intelligentsia, ideas arose and strengthened about the Ukrainian people separate from the Russian. There was not and could not be a historical basis here. Again, this phrase, there is not and could not be a historical basis here, is very similar to what we had in the Valuev circular. The Ukrainian language doesn't exist, and cannot exist. So I continue the quote. So the conclusions were based on a variety of fictions, up to the fact that Ukrainians are allegedly not Slavs at all, or conversely that Ukrainians are real Slavs, while Russians, Muscovites, are not. Such hypotheses began to be increasingly used for political purposes as an instrument of rivalry between European states. So in Russia today, we hear a lot about how the Ukrainian language is politicized, but that's exactly what the Russian Empire did. The Russian Empire politicized considerably the Ukrainian language, where they put the Ukrainian language on the same scale as those who would support the independence aspirations, for example, or further development of national aspirations. Closer to the end of his article, Putin goes to the Soviet era, where he says that that Ukraine became a child of the Soviet Union. Thus, modern Ukraine is entirely the brainchild of the Soviet era. We know and remember that to a large extent it was created at the expense of historical Russia. It is enough to compare which lands were reunited with the Russian state in the 17th century and which territories of the Ukrainian SSR left the Soviet Union. And the essay ends with elation that underlines Putin's slogan that the Russians and the Ukrainians are one people. I'm convinced that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible precisely in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, civilizational ties have been formed for centuries, go back to the same sources, tempered by common trials, achievements, and victories. Our kinship is passed down from generation to generation. It is the hearts in the memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together, we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful. After all, we are one people. And in this fragment, as you see, Putin refers to memory of these two peoples, again, that he puts under one umbrella of Russians. So and this fragment also sounds very prescriptive because as he takes this role of someone who imposes this understanding of the history on both the Russians and the Ukrainians. And the tone, again, is very similar to what we discussed earlier with the Valuev circular and with the EMS ukaz. So this kind of rhetoric contributed a lot to the gradual tension that was growing between Ukraine and Russia, not only during the last 10 years, but probably during the last 30 years since Ukraine became independent. And this tension never disappeared during the Soviet Union, and this tension was even more high during the Russian Empire. So what did I want to say with this attempt to close read these three different documents? I would say that in Putin's Russia, unfortunately, these memory frameworks, which were based on the ideologies that were formed during the Russian Empire, didn't change. They were not reworked. And that's what leads to this understanding, again, and the embracement of this understanding that the Russians and Ukrainians, according to Mr. Putin, are one people. What's going on in Ukraine? Of course, there are a lot of episodes from history that should be somehow reconsidered and which should be studied more carefully. But what I would like to emphasize today is that in Ukraine, these memory frameworks are changing, and they are marked with more openness than they are in the Russian Federation today. And one of the examples which transpired during these few days, which became very apparent and which really point to the change that's taking place in these memory frameworks, is the slogan which the Ukrainian people are using today. In 2014, the Russian Federation occupied the Crimea and occupied the Donbass. And the slogans that the Ukrainians were using a lot were something to the effect of "Save Ukraine, help Ukraine." Today, Ukrainians say Ukrainians will resist. Ukrainians do take agency, they do take control of their own fate, and they make it clear that they want to make their own choice in terms of how their country and their nation will be developing. Thank you.
Great. Natalia, thank you so much. Do you have any questions?
Yes, I have a question. How to fight the Russian propaganda, Natalia? So my question is specifically about this narrative to denazify Ukraine right now, right? And we have many Russian speakers and many Russian people who actually believe in that stupid idea. And they provide a very simple, very powerful, I would say, argument. But we do understand that that argument is not an argument because they have a distorted ideas about Ukrainian history and about Ukrainian society. But the argument is, Bandera is a hero, he cooperates with Nazis. So for those people who are completely brainwashed with Russian propaganda, what are you suggesting to, what kind of arguments are you suggesting to use?
Yeah, well, thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, Svetlana. It's a very good question, and it's a question that probably all of us are asking ourselves today. Because as probably you do, I also follow all the comments which are made by Russians who live in Russia, and that's exactly what they say, that Ukrainians are quote unquote Nazis, and that that's why this kind of aggression can be somehow justified. Well, point one, I would say that this change, this kind of change of attitude, right, to Ukraine and to the Ukrainians will not take within one day. It won't happen overnight, and it will take not probably months, but unfortunately years. And where do we start? As I mentioned in the concluding part of my presentation, we start with this work with memory frames, where we go away from imperialistic narratives. When we start reconsidering the heritage of the Russian Empire, not only in terms of great Russian culture, but we look at this culture and at this history from a different perspective. We all talk about Tolstoy, we all talk about Dostoevsky, but we talk about these writers as representatives of some humane messages and humane ideas. However, if we talk about Tolstoy in Anna Karenina said that the mission of the Russian Empire is to colonize and cultivate. And I think that maybe if we start approaching these texts from a more open perspective, where we consider both sides, maybe it can somehow contribute to the subversion of those beliefs which were formed and which were controlled, regulated under the Russian Empire and under the Soviet Union. Another thing also will be connected with the heritage of the Soviet Union. And again, as you know very well, in Russia today, there is a lot of reconstruction of the memory of the Soviet Union only in the positive aspect. So the question is why? Why don't we want to engage with some negative aspects? So it somehow fits the sense of greatness again. And it makes us feel probably good to realize that we are representatives of some great culture and great nation. But again, it contributes to neo-imperialistic sentiments and neo-imperialistic moods. And that's what leads to this intolerance toward other cultures, as in case with Ukraine today. Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't have any answer that would give a quick solution. Exactly. But I do hope, yeah.
Thank you, Natalia. Natalia, I'm first of all, I'm very happy that we are making this conversation and it will be uploaded to some sort of like other circulations of information, because we are now speaking a lot about Ukraine in the context of military and very kind of strategic plans of what is happening in Ukraine, and you are illuminating the erasure of the culture of Ukrainian language, of Ukrainian culture as a whole, and it's a very important thing that we are supposed to not forget in those times too. I'm listening to you, I'm also kind of understand how Putin's Russia, how the Kremlin is kind of imagining themselves Ukrainians and one people. And you said that no, Putin is always saying go to find the resources. If you will dig in the history, you will find. And he's approaching and he's saying one people, but in the same time, it's such a selective memory, because he's taking, he wants to constructing and rewriting the whole history of the region. And I'm asking you a very, very basic question, but what the hell it means one people if you're going, we and Ukrainians are one people, if you're invading to a country and you're actually killing people. How you can be one people if you're killing your own brothers and sisters, as you always kind of articulate yourself. So it's a culture, one people, it's a DNA, we have the same ethnogenesis kind of, so what does it mean? How are you intoxicating this thing? And also, I think that in context memory, and it's Svetlana, to yours also comment and question about the Russian propaganda, we know that so many Russians protesters are memory keepers. Right? Those Memorial and Последний Adres, the people who are investing their life in preserving the Soviet terror, are find themselves also in the radical opposition and suffers now in the way that they just shut it down. So in this case, again, memory, I agree with you, is a huge role and part in kind of trying to unpack the reality that we even that we just spoke with.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. In terms of one people, and I completely agree with you that Putin's approach is highly selective, and for historians, probably it's not even worth even engaging in this kind of conversation, whether what he's saying is right or falsified or any other thing. But what he's doing, yes, he is delivering this kind of understanding to the whole country, and not only to the whole country, not to Russia, but beyond Russia as well. That's the information which is consumed by Russian speakers across the world. And here I talk not only about Russians, but those people who learn Russian as their second language. And that's where the danger also increases. In terms of what he means by one people, in my opinion, by one people, he means only those people who agree with him. Okay. Those people who disagree with him, they are aliens, or in other words, they are enemies. And this language, us and them, again, is very dangerous, and it's very black and white. And as you pointed out, memory is not black and white, and culture is not black and white. That's why I did mention Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and how we read them, but it's also important to read them as something complex, not only those selected fragments that we would like to focus on, but those other fragments which are very uncomfortable. There are a lot of uncomfortable things in Dostoevsky's writing, but especially in the West, we are not open to read that. We do not want to deliver that to our students. And then why? In just a couple of days ago, I attended this American Council of Russian Teachers, and there was a very disturbing statement there. Let's focus on something positive about Russian history, Russian culture. So, and what are we accomplishing by this? Do we prepare our students to be relevant in their assessment of how Russia is developing today? Or we are just giving them information which makes, again, us feel good about Russian culture and Russian literature, and that's it. But don't we do harm to our students when we don't provide space to engage with those uncomfortable narratives? And there are a lot of uncomfortable narratives in Ukraine. There are issues which are connected with own UPA. There are issues which are connected with how Jewish population was treated. Today, we are talking about some issues with racism that, again, became very evident during these efforts to leave the country right now as the invasion started. But the thing is that probably we have to learn how to talk about these uncomfortable narratives, because they have to be discussed, they have to be worked through. It is part of our history and it is part of our memory. Memory is not only something positive.
I have another question. Do you have questions? Go ahead.
Natalia, we have another 7 minutes. I want to ask you another kind of linguistic question about, again, Svetlana's comment about denazification. For me, it's so ridiculous in so many possible ways because so a lot of people saying that Zelensky is a Jew, so how kind of the Ukrainian elite can be Nazified? But do you think that this ridiculous and stupid move, from Russian side was because Nazi or speaking about Nazism is intoxicating to the Russian kind of, Russian people, the biggest fear of their lives, and this is why he chose us. So kind of what is the logic of using and articulating the invasion to Ukraine by this thing that everyone are mocking right now, because everybody understands that there is no connection to reality. Kind of portraying those Nazis in Ukraine that are doing what they're doing.
Well, one of the explanations that I could offer is also connected with Mr. Putin having his international audiences in mind when he was coining these narratives. Because Nazism is something that will be condemned by any community. And it's so easy. This information is accessible to anyone. And this simplified narratives that he creates produce a lot of harm and damage, not only to Ukraine, but to the entire world. So that would be my explanation why he's exploiting these narratives about Nazism, about Nazification, because it's easy to deliver his message to the international communities. Not only to Russians, but to international communities as well. And of course, it creates some emotional stance, it creates some emotional response, and he doesn't have to invest much in order to get this kind of probably condemnation if they believe that Ukraine is somehow Nazified nation at the point. But again, it's complete nonsense. We understand that it's nonsense, but unfortunately, this nonsense has its own followers. Unfortunately, it works in some contexts. But as you pointed out, I think that we have to be. Point one, we have to be prepared in terms of how to engage with this kind of narrative. Because if someone tells me, well, there is no Nazis in Ukraine, and that's something that I believe, it won't work. So yes or no will not work. So we have to find some narratives with which we can engage in order to subvert this nonsense, subvert this, this stupid statements which are produced by the leader of the largest, in terms of geography, country in the world.
Thank you so much.
I have a quick question, if that's okay, Natalia. And it's thinking about the broader picture of Russian language politics. There are many republics which are part of Russian Federation, and when I hear about what kind of disposition the Russian political elites are taking towards Ukrainian language, I just want to ask what is going on with people in Chechnya, with people in Buryatia. How are they finding ways to continue using their language, and what is the official stance towards those republics which are part of the Federation?
You mean in terms of how they use Russian language or their own language?
Their own language, yeah. Because from what I understand, there's actually these processes are kind of happening simultaneously, where Russian is actually replacing other ethnic languages. And I'm just trying to ask, well, are all of these things connected, and what do we know about?
Well, I completely agree. All these things are very much connected. Unfortunately, I do not have any information on how things are in Chechnya or in other areas of the Russian Federation. I do not have that information. But in terms of the Russian language in Ukraine, I would like to again emphasize the fact that speaking Russian in Ukraine doesn't mean being Russian. And that's another point which was manipulated and which was instrumentalized time and again by Putin. So his rhetoric is, if you speak Russian, it means that you a priori Russian. But it's not true at all. And as you pointed out, yes, the Russian language is spoken in many countries. But when we take Russian language, for example, at universities or colleges, this language is associated only with Russia. And again, that's one of those tools that contribute to this Putin's rhetoric, that Russian language is only for Russians. And that's essentially what he's doing and what he has done so far with all those laws which were passed in the Russian Federation over the last 2-3 years, where they established the Russian language as the language of Russia only. And again, only through some educational efforts, somehow we can contribute to this more complex understanding of what the Russian language is. Again, this war today is not about the Russian language, but it is used for the war. Some ways to depoliticize the language should be found, but taking into consideration what has transpired since February 24th, it will be very, very difficult to find some other ways. But I do hope that it would be possible, and I do hope that some openness will be created for the Russian language, that it's not just the language of Russia, and that it can also be used to somehow debunk those which were created by Putin.